They said no one could survive alone in the Gobi for more than 3 days. Ruth Calloway had been out here for 11 years. She wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody is ever supposed to end up living alone in the middle of the world's 5th largest desert, 600 miles from the nearest city, with nothing but cracked earth, razor wind, and a sky so vast it makes you feel like a grain of sand that the universe forgot to blow away. But life has a brutal sense of humor, and Ruth Calloway had learned to laugh right back at it. The morning came the way it always did in the Gobi, without warning, without mercy, and without apology. 1 second the sky was the black of deep space, absolute and total, pinpricked by 10,000 stars burning so bright and so close you'd swear you could reach out and burn your fingers on them. Then, in the span of a single breath, the horizon cracked open like an egg. A thin line of burning copper split the eastern edge of the earth, and just like that, the desert woke up. Not gently. The Gobi doesn't do anything gently. Ruth was already awake. She'd been awake for an hour, sitting cross-legged on a thick woven mat inside her shelter, both hands wrapped around a battered tin cup of hot black tea, listening. That was the first rule of survival out here, the one she'd carved into the wooden beam above her door the first winter she stayed. Listen before you look. Look before you move. Move before it's too late. Her shelter was unlike anything you'd expect to find in the middle of a desert. From a distance, from very far away, it looked like nothing more than a mound of rust-colored earth, a low hill that the wind had shaped over centuries. That was intentional. Ruth had spent the better part of 2 years building it into the side of a natural sandstone formation, a massive amber-colored rock shelf that jutted from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient buried creature. She'd packed the walls with layers of compressed clay and dried camel grass, overlaid with panels of stretched hide from animals she'd hunted, then covered the whole structure in a thick coat of desert sand, mixed with a binding agent she'd improvised from boiled plant resin. In the summer, when the Gobi hit temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the thick walls kept the interior a survivable 80 degrees. In the winter, when temperatures dropped to -40, the structure held enough warmth from the clay-fired stove inside to keep her alive. She'd named the rock formation Sentinel. She'd named her shelter Anchor. She'd named this stretch of desert Home. The tea was bitter and strong, brewed from dried desert rose hips she'd collected in autumn and stored in sealed clay jars on a hand-built shelf along the north wall. The shelf also held 12 identical jars of dried wild onion, 7 jars of preserved meat she'd packed in salt, 4 large sealed containers of millet grain, and 32 carefully wrapped blocks of pressed dried dung fuel for the stove. Ruth knew the exact count of everything she owned. Out here, inventory wasn't a habit. It was the difference between living and not. She set the cup down and stood up slowly, her knees popping in the dry, cold air the way they always did first thing in the morning these days. She was 53 years old. Her body reminded her of that number constantly. Her mind refused to acknowledge it at all. Ruth Calloway had arrived in the Gobi as a field geologist working for an independent mineral survey company out of Denver, Colorado. The assignment was supposed to last 18 months. She was supposed to map subsurface formations across a 300-kilometer survey grid, file reports, collect samples, and go home. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver. She had a sister in Tucson she called on Christmas. She had a life, of sorts, waiting for her. Then a flash flood, the kind that happens in the Gobi maybe once every decade. A wall of water that roars down from mountain ranges 100 miles away and arrives in the desert like a judgment from God, swept away her base camp, her vehicle, her satellite communication equipment, and her research partner, a quiet 31-year-old man from Montana named Clark, on a Thursday morning in late September. The company's search and rescue team looked for her for 11 days. They never found the camp. They assumed she was dead. She was not dead. She pulled on her field jacket, a heavy canvas military surplus coat she'd repaired so many times with strips of hide and wire that barely an inch of the original fabric remained, and moved to the door. The door was a masterpiece of desert engineering, a thick slab of compressed sandstone fitted into a frame she'd built from salvaged vehicle chassis steel, sealed at the edges with packed clay that she reapplied every spring and fall. It swung open on a pair of heavy hinges she'd machined herself from scavenged metal, and it sealed so tight that sand couldn't get through the gap even during a full-blown sandstorm. She pushed it open and stepped outside. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. Not the cold of winter mountains, not the damp cold of ocean shores. The cold of the Gobi Desert in early March was a specific, unique, personally offensive kind of cold. Dry as a bone, sharp as glass, carrying on it the particular smell of frozen sand and empty space that Ruth had come to associate with the word alive. She breathed it in. The sky was enormous. The sky in the Gobi is always enormous, but in the early morning, when the sun was still low and the light was still angled and golden, it was something else entirely. The clouds that had gathered overnight, high, thin cirrus sheets that the Mongolian wind had dragged down from the north, caught the sunrise light and turned colors that had no names in English. Not orange, not pink, something between fire and water, something between a wound and a flower. Ruth stood on the flat stone platform she'd built outside her door, a smooth-fitted mosaic of flat desert rocks she'd carried one by one over the course of a summer, and she looked out across the landscape that was hers, not legally, not on any map, but hers in the only way that matters. She knew every inch of it. She knew where the water was. 3 separate underground seep points she'd located over years of patient observation, marked with cairns of stacked stones that she alone could read. She knew where the food was, the seasonal patterns of the Gobi's surprising wildlife, the Bactrian camels that passed through the eastern corridor in late spring, the gazelles that grazed the scrubland patches to the south in summer, the marmots in their burrows, the snakes in their rock crevices, the birds in their brief, miraculous migrations overhead. She knew where the danger was. And that morning, standing on her stone platform in the copper dawn, she looked down and saw something that made her stomach drop straight to the ground. Tracks. Fresh ones. The sand around the base of her shelter, usually undisturbed and flat as a table, had been walked through in the night. She crouched down slowly, her eyes scanning the pattern. Not human. The prints were wide, 4-toed, with the distinctive pressed heel pad and the spread of an animal that weighed somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds. She recognized them immediately because she'd seen them before, twice in the last decade, and both times they had meant that the next few days of her life were going to be a very serious test of everything she knew. Snow leopard. Not one. 3 separate sets of prints. 2 smaller, 1 massive. An adult male and 2 others, juveniles or a smaller female. Ruth didn't panic. She'd long since burned through her lifetime supply of panic, somewhere back in those first 3 months when she thought every morning might be her last. What she felt instead was the cold, sharp, clarifying sensation of a mind that had been trained by years of absolute necessity to process threat and respond with precision. Her eyes tracked the prints, reading the story they told. The animals had circled her shelter twice during the night. They'd approached to within 10 feet of the door. The large one had stood still in one place for what looked like a very long time. The depression was deeper, the edges more compressed, directly beside her water collection channel on the north side. They weren't passing through, they were investigating. Ruth stood back up and looked out at the desert. The sun was fully up now, burning gold above the eastern dunes. Somewhere out there in the vastness, 3 snow leopards, the Gobi's most secretive and most dangerous predator, an animal almost never seen and almost never survived when it decided you were prey, were watching her. She went back inside and started making plans. Ruth knew exactly what she had to do, and she knew exactly how much time she had to do it. Snow leopards don't attack in full daylight, not in open ground. They are ambush predators, creatures of shadow and patience, animals that will stalk the same target for 2 or 3 days before committing to a move. They had been here last night. They would be back tonight, or tomorrow night, or the night after. What she didn't know was whether they'd wait. The large male, she could tell from the spread of that enormous paw print that this was a dominant adult, probably 8 or 9 years old, at the peak of his physical capability, had lingered. Animals that linger are animals that are calculating. That made him the most dangerous kind. She pulled the wooden crate from under the sleeping shelf, a rough-cut box she'd built from scrap wood salvaged from the wreckage of an abandoned survey vehicle she'd found half buried in a dune 7 miles south back in year 3, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay her 2 most important tools. The first was a bolt-action rifle, a Remington 700 that she'd carried in from Denver as part of her field equipment, maintained religiously for 11 years on the 2-ounce bottle of gun oil she'd rationed so carefully she still had 1/3 of it left. It was loaded. It was always loaded. The second item was a coil of aircraft cable, 1/2 an inch thick, left over from a cargo strapping system she'd stripped off the wrecked survey vehicle. Strong enough to hold a fully loaded helicopter. Strong enough, she reasoned, to hold a snow leopard if she rigged it right. The cable trap was not a new idea. Ruth had set similar rigs twice before in the years she'd been here. Once for a wolf pack that had been stalking her during a particularly brutal February, and once for a pair of wild Bactrian camels that had taken to smashing her water collection system in the night. Both times the rigs had worked well enough to buy her time. This situation was different. Snow leopards were faster, smarter, and far more dangerous than anything she'd dealt with before. She was going to need more than a cable snare. She was going to need a complete defensive system. She spent the first hour of the morning checking her water supply. This was always the first task, non-negotiable, the anchor around which every other decision in her day was organized. The Gobi's underground water was not generous. The 3 seep points she'd located over the years produced a combined daily flow of approximately 4 liters, barely enough to survive on. And she supplemented this with a dew collection system she'd engineered on the roof of her shelter, a series of angled metal panels salvaged from vehicle wreckage that condensed overnight moisture and channeled it into a sealed cistern she'd cut from stone. In winter, she also melted ice from the shallow frozen pans that formed in low-lying areas of the desert floor after cold nights. Her total water reserve at any given time was between 40 and 60 liters. She never let it drop below 30. This morning, the dew panels had collected just under 2 liters. She poured them carefully into the cistern, noted the total, 44 liters, and moved on. The second task was the scanning post. About 60 meters north of her shelter, Ruth had built what she called the Watch. It was a simple structure, a platform of flat stone and steel rod, elevated about 15 feet off the ground by 4 corner posts she'd driven deep into the desert floor and secured with cable stays. It wasn't elegant, but it was solid, and it gave her a clear line of sight across the desert in all directions for roughly 2 miles. She climbed it every morning, the metal rungs she'd welded onto the support posts cold and sharp under her gloved hands, and spent 10 minutes scanning the surrounding terrain with a pair of 10 by 42 binoculars, military surplus, traded for a supply of salt and dried meat from a Mongolian herder family she'd encountered in year 4, the last humans she'd had any contact with. She reached the top of the Watch and brought the binoculars to her eyes. The desert stretched out in every direction, vast and quiet and deceptively empty. To the north, the flat gravel plains of the Gobi steppe extended to the horizon, broken only by low, rounded dunes and isolated outcroppings of weathered rock. To the east, the terrain dropped into a shallow depression, what the Mongolians called a Tsagan Tenger, a white basin, where salt and mineral deposits created a bleached, luminous plain that glittered in the morning light. To the south, the dunes rose. To the west, the rock formations, the great amber ridgeline she called the Wall, ran for miles. She found them on the third sweep, northwest, moving along the base of a dune ridge about a mile and a half out. Two were clearly visible, tawny shapes against the pale sand, moving with the liquid, boneless grace that made snow leopards look like something between a large cat and a hallucination. The third she only caught as a flicker of shadow, deeper into the rocks. The big one. He was working from cover. She watched for 4 full minutes, completely still, tracking the patterns of their movement. They were not hunting, not yet. They were familiarizing themselves with the terrain, learning the ground between the dunes and her shelter, mapping their approach routes the way she mapped everything out here, methodically, patiently, with the calm deliberation of a predator that had never needed to rush. Ruth lowered the binoculars. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. 11 years of desert survival had burned away every ounce of unnecessary emotion, leaving something behind that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. Something in between. Something that the desert had made. She descended the watch and began preparing. There were 3 things she needed to accomplish before nightfall. Set the cable trap at the approach corridor on the northwest side of her shelter, pack a travel kit for the journey she needed to make that afternoon, and dig the defensive channel she'd been planning at the east side of the rock shelf. The cable trap took 2 hours. She ran the half-inch aircraft cable through a series of steel eyelets she pounded into the rock face, rigged a spring-loaded anchor mechanism from a compressed coil of truck spring steel she'd been saving for years, and concealed the whole assembly under a carefully raked layer of sand and loose gravel. The trigger mechanism was a flat pressure plate she'd machined from a sheet of aluminum, sitting on a hair trigger assembly that would fire with approximately 30 pounds of pressure. Light enough to catch a leopard mid-stride, too heavy to be triggered by wind or small animals. When the trap fired, the cable loop would tighten around whatever limb had triggered it and lock. She couldn't kill a snow leopard with a cable trap, but she could hold one long enough to change the odds. She stood back, looked at the concealed trap site, and felt the desert wind tug at her jacket. The sun was almost directly overhead. She had maybe 5 hours of good light left. She went inside, packed her travel bag, water bottle, fire kit, fishing gear, the folded hide blanket she used as an emergency overnight shelter, a day's ration of dried meat, and slung it over her shoulder. There was a secondary water source she needed to check. A spring-fed pool in a rock hollow about 4 miles southeast, a place she called the Bowl, where groundwater surfaced through a crack in a granite shelf and formed a shallow, clear pool no bigger than a dining table. It was the only reliable open water source within a day's travel, and if she was going to be locked down in defensive mode for the next several nights, she needed to top off her reserve. She also needed food. The dried meat on her shelf was sufficient for 2 weeks, but if she could catch fresh fish in the Bowl's feeder stream, a narrow ribbon of water that trickled down from the rock shelf into a sandy catchment, she'd extend her reserve considerably. She checked the rifle. Loaded. Safety on. She stepped over the concealed trap with practiced precision, her feet following the memorized path around the hidden assembly, and turned her face southeast. The Gobi opened up in front of her, empty and immense and utterly indifferent. Somewhere behind her, 3 snow leopards were watching. She walked. The Gobi is not the desert people imagine when they think of deserts. Most people, when you say desert, picture Lawrence of Arabia, golden dunes, endless sand seas, soft curves and silence. That's the Sahara. The the Gobi is something else entirely. It is a cold desert, a high-altitude desert, a desert of gravel plains and salt flats and jagged stone ridges and sudden, shocking pockets of life. Small springs, hidden meadows, bursts of wild grass and twisted saxaul trees, all of it set against a backdrop of scale that is simply too large for the human brain to fully process. You can walk for 3 hours in the Gobi and feel like you haven't moved at all. The landmarks stay the same size. The horizon doesn't get any closer. You and the desert are locked in a standoff that the desert is always going to win. Ruth had learned to walk differently out here. Not the hurried, destination-focused stride of a city person, not even the purposeful march of a field researcher. She had learned the long-haul walk, steady, measured, low impact, conserving energy with every step, reading the ground constantly for changes in terrain that might signal loose sand, hidden rock, or the subtle depressions that sometimes indicated subsurface voids. She walked with her eyes moving between the ground 3 feet ahead and the horizon 2 miles out, a rhythm of attention that had become unconscious after years of practice. It was cold. In early March, the Gobi's daytime temperatures on the gravel plains hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing, but calm. The wind, when it came, drove the chill factor down to dangerous levels. She watched the sky as she walked. The high cirrus from the morning had thickened into a lower, grayer overcast, and she could see the characteristic banding pattern on the northern horizon that meant wind was building up in the mountain passes above the steppe. A sandstorm was possible by evening. Not certain, but possible. That changed her timing. She needed to reach the bowl, fill her water containers, fish the feeder stream, and get back to her shelter before the wind hit. She was making good time. The terrain between anchor and the bowl was familiar ground. She'd walked this route dozens of times in all conditions, and her pace was steady, her breathing controlled. She passed the salt flat marker, a large, upright stone she'd placed at the edge of the bleached basin years ago, and angled southeast along the gravel ridge that would lead her to the rock shelf. At mile 3, she stopped. The ground in front of her was wrong. It took her brain a fraction of a second to identify why, and then it hit her all at once. Tracks again. Not leopard this time. These were larger, heavier, deeper. The splayed oval prints of a large Bactrian camel, pressed deep into a patch of damp clay near the drainage channel she was following. But the shape was off. The stride was wrong. Too long, too heavy on one side. Irregular. She crouched and studied the prints carefully. The left foreleg impression was deeper and wider at the leading edge, suggesting the animal was favoring it, putting extra weight forward to compensate for something wrong with the right. Injured. A lone, injured camel, which meant it had separated from a herd, or there was no herd. A solitary animal, possibly the one she'd spotted tracks of 3 weeks ago to the southeast, which she'd been watching with cautious interest. She filed the information and moved on. An injured Bactrian camel was simultaneously a potential food source and a potential problem. A healthy camel was one of the few large animals in the Gobi that wasn't afraid of humans. Centuries of domestication had left the species with a dangerous combination of strength, stubbornness, and fearlessness. An injured one, in pain and disoriented, was unpredictable. The rock shelf came into view at the end of the 4th mile. The great granite wall rising from the desert floor, dark and ancient, its face cracked by a million freeze-thaw cycles into geometric patterns that looked almost deliberate, like something carved by enormous hands. Water had been seeping through that granite for 10,000 years. Ruth could smell it. A faint, mineral-clean scent that cut through the dry sand smell of the desert like a knife through dry bread. She climbed down into the hollow and found the bowl. It was as she'd left it 3 weeks ago, small and still and perfect, the surface of the water so flat and clear It looked like polished glass. She knelt at the edge and looked down through the water. She could see the sandy bottom clearly, 4 feet down, and the faint wavering of the spring entry point where the water pushed up from the granite crack. And there, 3 of them. Trout. Desert trout, or more accurately, the Mongolian grayling that had somehow colonized this improbable little spring system, fat and still in the cold water, hovering over the sandy bottom in the way fish do when they're comfortable and undisturbed. She set up her fishing kit. It was simple, a short length of flexible wire as a rod, a reel of monofilament line she'd manufactured herself by drawing out strips of synthetic fabric over a fire to the right thickness, a hand-carved bone hook tipped with a small piece of dried red meat. She wasn't in a hurry. The fish weren't going anywhere. She settled onto a flat rock at the edge of the bowl, dropped the line in, and waited. The first fish took the hook in less than 4 minutes. It was big, easily 2 pounds, and it fought hard for a small pool, running the line back and forth before she brought it to the surface and lifted it out. She dispatched it quickly and placed it in her net bag. The second fish took longer, 20 minutes, but it came, another solid grayling, slightly smaller than the first. She was reaching for the bag to secure the second fish when she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind picking up, a low, rhythmic sound, half vibration and half tone, coming from somewhere north of the rock shelf. She froze, listening with the complete stillness she'd developed over years of paying attention to the desert's language. And then she heard it again, clearer this time, a sound like distant rolling thunder. Except there was no thunder in the Gobi in March. She was up and moving to the top of the rock shelf in 15 seconds, binoculars out and raised before she'd fully steadied herself. She swept north, east, northwest. She found them on the northwest bearing, not 1.5 miles away now. Closer, much closer. 2 visible shapes moving fast, low to the ground, through the scattered rock formations between the dune field and her position. The fluid, ground-eating sprint of large cats fully committed to speed. They were coming this direction. And behind the first 2, just clearing the edge of a dune, massive, unhurried, moving with a terrifying economy of motion, the large male. They weren't investigating anymore. Run. Not a thought, not a decision. A command issued from somewhere below conscious thought, from the part of the brain that is older than language and smarter than logic, the part that has been keeping human beings alive since before we had words for danger. Ruth was down off the rock shelf in seconds, net bag over shoulder, rifle in hand, feet finding the ground at a full sprint before she'd consciously decided on direction. Direction was already decided. The only direction that mattered was home. 4 miles. In normal conditions, good weather, good energy, no stress, she could walk 4 miles in about 70 minutes. Running, on desert terrain, with a pack, at altitude, with cold air tearing at her lungs, the math was brutal. She could maybe sustain a full sprint for 200 yards. After that, it was going to be an ugly, grinding, desperate run walk that would take everything she had. She looked back over her shoulder once, just once, at the top of the first low ridge. The 2 smaller leopards had crested the rock shelf. She could see them clearly without the binoculars now. Tawny shapes the color of dry sand, moving low and fast with their bellies almost brushing the ground, the way cats move when they are fully locked onto prey. They were closing, not sprinting yet, conserving, pacing, letting her exhaust herself, but closing the gap with a horrible, steady efficiency. She turned back and ran. The gravel plain was hard and flat and merciless, every footfall sending shocks up her legs that her knees absorbed with a grinding resentment. She set her eyes on the salt-flat marker, the upright stone, 1.5 miles ahead, and she ran for it the way a drowning person swims for a shore they're not sure they can reach. Her breath came in huge, ragged pulls, the cold air burning her throat and lungs, her vision narrowing to the immediate ground ahead and the distant rock formations of home. She hit the salt flat boundary and crossed it without stopping. The ground changed here from gravel to the harder packed clay of the mineral basin, and her footing improved slightly. She was gasping, her legs starting to tremble with the sustained effort, but she was moving. Behind her, the sounds had changed. The casual, pacing pursuit had shifted into something faster. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear it. The faint percussion of padded feet on gravel, closer than before. The wind hit her broadside, hard and cold, a wall of air from the north that staggered her and slapped the breath out of her chest. The building storm she'd seen on the horizon had arrived early. Sand began to move. At first, just the surface layer stirring, individual grains lifting and skipping. Then more, the air thickening with a fine tan haze that reduced visibility and scoured every exposed inch of her skin. Under different circumstances, a sandstorm would have been her enemy. Out here, in this moment, the rising sand was cover. She ran into it. The world narrowed to a 30-foot circle of visibility. The light went from gold to gray to a dim brownish twilight. Sand hissed against her jacket and bit at her face above the scarf she pulled up over her nose. She ran blind now, navigating by memory and by the feel of the ground under her feet, by the slope of the terrain and the position of the wind and the ancient practiced map of this place that was written not on paper, but into her muscles and her balance and her blood. She thought she'd lost them. For 200 meters, she couldn't hear anything behind her except the roar of the wind and the rushing hiss of driven sand. Then the roar came from the left. Close. 20 feet, maybe less. The sound hit her like a physical blow, a full-throated, open-jawed snarl from the near dark, raw and enormous and absolutely close. So close she felt the vibration of it in her chest. She spun, rifle up, and fired into the sand-thick air in the direction of the sound. The blast of the shot was swallowed instantly by the wind. She didn't know if she'd hit anything. She didn't stop to find out. She ran. The rock formation of home appeared out of the sand haze like a vision, the great amber bulk of Sentinel looming up from the desert floor exactly where it was supposed to be, solid and dark and real. She was 60 meters out, 50, 40. She remembered the trap. She angled right, the clear path she'd memorized, 30 degrees east of the direct approach, threading between two buried rock anchors that marked the boundaries of the concealed cable assembly. Her feet knew the route. She'd walked it 100 times in practice, slow and deliberate, imprinting the exact coordinates of every step. She hit the exact right line and ran it without deviation, trusting the memory in her legs completely, and came to the door with her hands already reaching for the handle. The handle. Her fingers were numb, full, dead numb, the tactile sensation completely gone, her gloved hands responding like thick, unresponsive pads of meat. She clawed at the handle, her breath coming in panicked sobs, her entire body shaking with exertion and cold and adrenaline, and the handle turned, and the door opened, and she threw herself through it and into the dark of the interior. She hit the floor. She rolled. She got her back against the rear wall, and her rifle pointed at the door in one single, instinctual motion. Then she reached out with her foot and kicked the door shut. The bolt. She crawled to it, seized the iron deadbolt with both hands, and drove it home with everything she had. A second later, something hit the outside of the door hard enough to shake the walls. The door held. Whatever had hit it, she was almost certain it was the large male. She could hear the size of him and the sheer mass of the impact. Hit it once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, each blow shaking the steel-framed slab in its stone housing and raining fine grit from the ceiling down onto her head. She sat against the far wall, rifle across her lap, and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, counting, the way she'd learned to do in those first terrible months when every night brought the possibility of death, and the only thing keeping her from disintegrating into full panic was the act of counting breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. She listened to the sounds outside. The wind was a constant roar now, the full sandstorm in effect, which was both good and bad. Good because the storm would reduce visibility for the leopards just as it did for her, limit their movements, make them uncomfortable. Bad because she couldn't hear exactly where they were or what they were doing. She could hear the large one. He was still outside the door. She could hear him moving along the rock face, the scrape of massive paws on sandstone, the occasional low vocalization that wasn't quite a growl, more like a sustained vibration of air, a sound that seemed designed specifically to communicate absolute size and absolute intent. She'd read about snow leopards before she came to the Gobi, back in Denver, in the academic way that field geologists read about the wildlife of the regions they were going into. She remembered one detail from a wildlife biology paper she'd skimmed in a journal waiting room. Snow leopards have been described by indigenous hunters as the ghost cat, rarely seen, almost never heard. This animal had not read that paper. She pulled herself up off the floor and checked her weapons. The rifle had 1 round in the chamber and 4 in the magazine. She had 16 additional rounds in the small ammunition box on the gear shelf, a total of 21 rounds. More than enough, if her aim was good and her nerve held. She moved carefully to the narrow observation slit she'd cut into the north wall of the shelter when she built it, a gap about 3 inches wide and 8 inches tall, framed with steel, positioned so she could see the approach corridor from the northwest without exposing herself. She looked through it. The sand was thick enough that she couldn't see more than 15 feet. In that 15 feet of visibility she could see, barely, the disturbed surface near the trap site. Something had walked over it. The sand was scattered in a way that suggested weight and movement, but she couldn't tell in the storm's turbulence whether the concealed trigger had been contacted. Then she saw the paw. Just the paw, nothing else. It came into the narrow frame of her slit, enormous and pale-furred, pressing down onto the sand at the exact edge of the trap zone, feeling the ground with the deliberate, weight-testing pressure of an animal that knew something was wrong. The leopard paused there, weight on 1 foot, not committing. He was suspicious. He could sense the trap, not see it, but sense it the way wild animals sense things that are wrong with the ground, with a kind of accumulated somatic wisdom that domesticated creatures have lost. Ruth raised the rifle and lined up the slit. She waited. The paw withdrew. She exhaled slowly. For the next 40 minutes she sat motionless at the observation slit, watching, listening. The storm's intensity peaked and began to ease. The visibility extended from 15 feet to 30, then 50. She could see the full entrance area now. The disturbed sand around the trap zone showed multiple sets of prints. All 3 animals had investigated the area at some point. All 3 had stopped short of triggering the mechanism. These were not stupid animals. She needed a different approach. She went to the gear shelf and took down the tin case that held her fire kit, the one she used for signaling as well as warmth. Inside was a cloth pouch of chemical fire-starting powder she'd assembled from components in her equipment inventory. Potassium permanganate crystals from the water purification kit, glycerin from the machine lubricant container. Separately, they were useful. Together, if she was careful, and she was always careful, they produced an intensely hot, fast-burning reaction that could light wet wood in a blizzard, or, if she needed it to, produce a burst of bright, acrid smoke that animals with sensitive noses found deeply unpleasant. She packed a small clay pot with the mixture and added a wick of braided cordage. Then she went to the secondary exit. The secondary exit was the one thing about her shelter she never talked about. Not that there was anyone to tell. A low crawlway, barely 18 inches high, cut through the base of the sandstone formation on the south side, concealed outside by a flat rock she could shift from within. It came out in a protected hollow in the rock face, behind a natural screen of boulders, 20 feet from the main entrance and invisible from the northwest approach. She'd built it in year 2, after a night when a pack of wild dogs had surrounded her, and she'd lain awake realizing she had only one way in or out. She'd never needed it until now. She pulled the flat stone aside, pushed the clay pot through first, then flattened herself and crawled out into the biting cold. The wind hit her immediately. The storm was still active, reduced but fierce, and the sand cut at her eyes above the scarf. She moved low and fast along the protected south face of the rock, using the boulder screen as cover, until she was at the edge of the rock that gave her a sightline to the north side. She counted to 3. She lit the wick and threw the clay pot around the rock corner, in a high arc that would land it directly in the approach corridor between the Leopards and her door. The explosion of light and smoke was immediate and violent, a bright white-orange flash followed by a dense, billowing cloud of thick black smoke that the wind seized and drove directly into the northwest approach. The chemical smell was immediate and overwhelming, a sharp, acrid bite that cut through even the sandstorm's dusty scent. The reaction from the animals was instant. She heard it even over the wind, a short, explosive burst of startled sound, paws scrabbling on hard ground, and then the distinct pattern of fast movement retreating. All 3 of them, moving fast, away from the smoke and the light and the smell, back toward the dune field. Ruth didn't wait. She was back through the crawlway in 20 seconds, pulling the flat stone back into place, and back at the observation slit with the rifle in her hands before the smoke cloud had fully dispersed. The approach corridor was empty. She watched for 10 minutes. Nothing came back. She allowed herself one long, shaking breath. Then she went and stoked the stove and put water on to boil, because survival isn't only about the dramatic moments. It's also about making sure you eat and drink and rest, so that when the next dramatic moment comes, you're ready. The storm blew itself out by mid-evening, leaving behind it a silence so complete and so absolute that Ruth could hear the blood moving in her ears. She sat by the stove with the second grayling on a flat stone, cooking slowly over the embers, the fish skin crisping and the smell of it filling the small interior of the shelter with a warmth that was as much emotional as physical. She ate slowly. The fish was perfect, firm white flesh, clean and mineral tasting, the kind of food that makes your body feel like it's being repaired from the inside out. She ate every part of it, the way she ate everything out here, wasting nothing, using everything. The bones went into the pot with water and the remaining herbs for a thin broth she'd drink before sleeping. The skin she'd render tomorrow for a thin coat of oil on her tools. Outside, nothing moved. Or if it did, she couldn't hear it. She went to the observation slit every 20 minutes. The sand had settled in the aftermath of the storm into new configurations. Drifts had formed against the rock face and the door frame, soft and blue-white in the moonlight that was now coming through breaks in the clearing overcast. The trap site was covered. She couldn't tell if it had been disturbed. She wasn't going outside tonight. That was decided. In the morning, she'd reassess. Tonight was for resting, for restoring the energy she'd burned in the run, for thinking carefully and clearly about what the next several days required. She opened the small wooden box she kept at the head of her sleeping shelf, a box she'd made from vehicle debris and fitted with a close-fitting lid that kept the contents dry and safe. Inside were the things she'd brought with her from the world. A folded photograph of her sister standing outside her house in Tucson, squinting against the sun, laughing at something off camera. A small field notebook, its pages now completely filled with 11 years of observations, measurements, sketches, and calculations. A compass, its housing cracked, but its needle still true. A round, smooth river stone she'd carried in her jacket pocket for 30 years. A habit from her childhood, the feel of it in her hand, a kind of anchor to a self that predated the Gobi, predated the flood, predated survival. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Her sister's face was blurry with years of handling. She'd looked at it so many times the surface had softened, but she could still see the laugh in it. The specific way her sister's eyes crinkled at the outside corners when she was genuinely amused. She wondered, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, what her sister thought had happened to her. She'd been declared legally dead 3 years after the flood, she was fairly certain. By now she'd be a memory, a sad story, someone people occasionally remembered with a brief sadness. Ruth Calloway, geologist, lost in the Gobi Desert, 42 years old. She was 53 now, 11 more years of living than anyone thought she was owed. She put the photograph back, closed the lid, and lay down. Sleep didn't come immediately. It rarely did on the nights when adrenaline had been running high. Her body was exhausted in the way only a true physical emergency can exhaust a body. Deep, cellular. The kind of tired that goes down to the bone. But her mind was still moving, still processing, still running the calculation of threat and response that had kept her alive for a decade. The leopards were intelligent. That was the core of the problem. She could set traps and create deterrents, and they might work once, maybe twice, but a persistent and intelligent predator would adapt. The large male had already demonstrated the ability to detect and avoid a concealed trap. That level of environmental awareness was extraordinary, the kind of thing that wildlife biologists spent careers studying. The fire smoke deterrent had worked tonight, but a large and persistent cat would acclimate to novel stimuli within 48 hours. She had maybe 2 more uses of that method before it lost its shock value. She needed to change the situation fundamentally. There were 3 options, the way she saw it. Option 1, wait them out. Snow leopards were territorial but not necessarily persistent. If she denied them access to her site, sealed the water collection channel, removed any attractant that might be bringing them here in the first place, they might move on. She'd seen this happen with other predators over the years, but snow leopards were different. They operated on ranges of hundreds of square miles and sometimes maintained focal points in their range for years. They might not move on. Option 1 was passive, and passive wasn't reliable. Option 2, relocate. She could pack her essential supplies and move her base of operations to the secondary shelter she'd built in year 6. A smaller, simpler structure in the rock hollow near the bowl, 4 miles southeast. She'd built it as an emergency fallback, and it had a natural rock face barrier on 3 sides that would make predator access significantly harder. But moving meant vulnerability during the transit, and transit in an active predator hunting scenario was the highest risk moment. Moving was option 2 only if the shelter became completely untenable. Option 3, resolve the confrontation definitively. She didn't want that. She'd never killed anything she didn't need to eat, and even those killings, the gazelle, the marmot, the birds, carried a weight she felt every time. The desert had not made her callous. It had made her precise, and precision included knowing the value of what you were taking. A snow leopard was one of the rarest and most extraordinary animals on Earth. The thought of killing one made something clench in her chest that had nothing to do with cowardice, and everything to do with the specific kind of love you develop for the creatures you've shared a landscape with for a decade. But option 3 was on the table, because the table was life and death. and sentiment, however deep, didn't belong there. She fell asleep with her hand around the smooth river stone, her breath slowing to a rhythm that matched the soft creak of the cooling stove. And she dreamed. In the dream, the desert was lit from inside. The sand was warm and amber, glowing from some source she couldn't locate, and the sky above it was not black but deep blue, the blue of the Mediterranean Sea on a windless day, dotted with stars that moved slowly in great arcing paths, crossing and recrossing each other like the figures in an old celestial map. She was standing on the flat gravel plains south of Sentinel, except that the plain was larger in the dream, larger than any space she'd ever stood in, extending to every horizon in all directions, so vast and flat and open that the curve of the earth itself was visible. She felt, standing there, not small, but precise, the exact right size for exactly where she was. The leopard came from the north, not running, not stalking, walking, slow and deliberate across the warm-lit sand, moving with the fluid, boneless grace of the species, but without any of the danger in it, the way you might imagine the spirit of a thing moving, all the essence and none of the menace. He was enormous. In the dream she could see him clearly, more clearly than she'd seen the real animals in the daylight or through binoculars. The thick, smoke-gray and black-spotted coat, the incredibly long tail, the broad, powerful face with those pale eyes that seemed to contain light rather than reflect it. He stopped 10 feet in front of her. She didn't move. In the dream, she felt no fear. She felt only the specific, sharp, almost painful sensation of recognition, the feeling of looking at something and understanding, without words, its exact nature and your exact relationship to it. The leopard sat down. He looked at her with those pale, light-containing eyes, and she looked back at him. And in the way of dreams, something was understood between them that couldn't be put into language. Something about the terms under which two living things could share a piece of the earth. Something about the ancient, careful negotiation between predator and survivor. Something about the price of belonging to a place and the obligations that came with it. Then the light faded, and the dream dissolved, and she woke up. The morning had arrived while she slept, not the dramatic, copper-cracked sunrise of the day before, but a gentler, cooler emergence, the desert light coming up gray and then white, and then gradually golden behind a thin overcast. She lay still for a moment, her hands still around the river stone, listening to the silence outside. It was a different silence from last night, looser. The compressed, vibrating silence of predator presence had lifted. She could feel it the way you can sometimes feel the change in a room when someone has left it. She got up, made tea, ate a handful of dried berries and a small portion of pressed millet cake, checked every system in the shelter, the water level in the cistern, 41 liters, the fuel supply, sufficient for 10 more days at current stove usage, the rifle, loaded, safety on, positioned by the door. She slid the deadbolt back, paused with her hand on the handle, listening one last moment. Then she opened the door. The morning desert was still. The storm had remade the near terrain. Dunes shifted, surface patterns changed, new drifts pressed against the rock face. The approach corridor that she'd concealed the cable trap in was altered. She looked at the trap site and felt her breath stop for a moment. The sand was disturbed. Not the way wind disturbs sand, randomly, in ripples. This was directional, patterned, the specific disturbance of weight applied and then removed. Something had been there. She moved to the trap site carefully, stepping along her memorized safe path, and crouched to look closely. The concealed trigger mechanism had been activated. The cable was taut, drawn to its full extension, locked into the rock eyelet. Whatever had triggered it, though, was gone. She could see where the cable had been wrapped, around a limb, a paw, and then removed or released. The anchor held, but the caught thing was gone. There was a shallow drag line in the sand extending west, toward the dune field, and 3 meters from the trap, pressed into a softer patch of sand, the single, unmistakable clear print of the large male's right front paw. The pad was marked with a thin line of dried blood. She'd nicked him. Not badly. The cable had caught his paw, and the trigger release had cut a shallow wound before he pulled free. But she'd caught him. The ghost cat, the untouchable, the animal that wildlife scientists called the most elusive large predator on Earth, had been caught in Ruth Calloway's trap. She straightened up and looked west, toward the dune field. Nothing visible, nothing audible. She thought about the dream, about the terms between predator and survivor, about the price of belonging. She went back inside and got her rifle, her binoculars, and her day pack. She spent 20 minutes carefully resetting the cable trap, this time with a slightly different trigger geometry, positioned to catch rather than wound. She replaced the concealed sand layer and stood back. Then she went to the watch and climbed it. She scanned the terrain for 30 minutes. She found the 2 smaller leopards in the far dune field, moving northeast, away from her position. They were traveling at a sustained pace, not the investigative circling of yesterday, but a directed movement, leaving. The wound and the trap and the fire smoke and the gunshot had done their collective work. The smaller animals were going. She looked for the male for a long time. She found him last, to the northwest, sitting on a sand ridge 3 miles out. Just sitting, watching. In the full light of the Gobi morning, he was extraordinary, visible now without binoculars as a pale shape against the crest of the dune, completely still, his tail curled around him in the unhurried way of an animal that is not threatened, is not attacking, is simply present. For 30 seconds, across 3 miles of open desert, Ruth Calloway and the largest snow leopard she'd ever seen looked at each other. Then he turned and walked north and was gone. She came back down off the watch and stood at the base of the platform in the morning light, and for a long moment she didn't move. She just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 11 years. 11 years of mornings that could have been the last one. 11 years of rationing and repairing and rebuilding. 11 years of walking 4 miles for water, of fighting the wind and the cold and the heat and the isolation with the only weapons that actually work out here: knowledge, patience, and the refusal to give up. She thought about Clark sometimes, the young man from Montana who'd gone into the floodwater and never come out. She thought about him whenever the desert handed her a test she almost failed, whenever the calculation of survival tipped close enough to the wrong side that she could see it from where she stood. She thought about him as a reason to keep standing. Not survivor's guilt, not quite. Just the acknowledgement that being alive, out here, in this, was not an accident. It was a daily choice, made in the dark when the leopards were outside the door, made in the cold when the water was low, made in the loneliness when the sky was too large and she was too small, and the photograph of her sister's laughing face was the only human thing she could touch. She went back to work. The shelter needed attention after the storm. Sand had packed into the ventilation channel on the east side, which she cleared with a thin metal rod she kept for the purpose. The dew collection panels on the roof had shifted slightly in the wind and needed to be realigned, 2 of the cable stays retightened. She spent an hour on maintenance and then turned to the food preparation that she'd delayed the previous day. The first grayling, cleaned and scaled and cut into portions, half smoked over the embers of the stove, half dried in thin strips on the mesh rack she'd built above the stove's heat. The smell of smoked fish filled the shelter, and for the first time in 2 days, Ruth Calloway felt something she recognized as peace. Not the peace of safety. She was never fully safe out here, and she'd long since stopped expecting to be. Not the peace of certainty, because the desert offered none of that either. The peace of someone who had been tested, thoroughly and without mercy, and had come through it. The peace of knowing, in the deepest, most unargued part of herself, that she belonged here. That the Gobi had taken everything from her 11 years ago, and in return had given her something that no city, no career, no life of ordinary comfort could have ever offered. The knowledge of exactly who she was when everything else was stripped away. She ate lunch sitting on the stone platform outside her door. The smoked fish, the last of the dried berries, hot tea from the stove. The sky above the Gobi was clear now, the storm overcast completely gone. The blue of it so deep and saturating, it looked like something you could fall upward into forever. The sand around her was new patterned from the storm, every surface remade, everything redrawn. The Gobi did this constantly, erased and rewrote itself again and again, indifferent to what it covered over. She had learned not to mourn what the desert took away. She had learned to read what it wrote in its place. 3 miles north, somewhere in the dune field, a large snow leopard was moving through his territory, carrying a small wound on his right paw that would heal in a week, carrying also, she chose to believe this, some adjusted understanding of the creature that lived in the rock shelter by the Amber Ridge, an understanding that included perhaps a new category, not prey, not predator, something else. A presence in the landscape that occupied its own space and defended it and belonged to it and was not to be trifled with. She thought about the dream again, the warm-lit desert, the pale eyes, the wordless understanding. She wasn't a superstitious woman. She was a trained scientist who believed in data, in measurement, in the empirical record. But 11 years alone in a place as ancient and as enormous as the Gobi had a way of softening the hard edges between categories. She believed in data. She also believed in the dream. Both things were true. She finished her tea, set the cup down, and looked out at the horizon. Somewhere out there, east, beyond the salt flat, beyond the limits of what her binoculars could reach, there was a world full of people living lives she could barely remember. Traffic and schedules, news and noise, the endless, exhausting friction of human civilization pressed in on itself. She didn't miss it. She had not missed it for a very long time. What she had, out here, the silence, the scale, the absolute honesty of a place that never pretended to be anything other than what it was worth every hardship, every close call, every night when the temperature dropped and the darkness pressed in, and survival was a matter of doing the next correct thing, and then the next, and then the next, until morning. She stood up from the stone platform, brushed the fish flakes from her jacket, and looked one last time toward the northwest. The desert was empty. The desert was full. Both things, always, at the same time. She went inside, latched the door behind her, and began preparing for tomorrow. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a place that feels like theirs. Ruth Calloway found hers in the hardest place on earth, and she held on to it with everything she had. If this story found something in you, the part that wonders what you're made of, the part that believes survival is the most human thing there is, then you already know where you belong. This is Gobi Survival. Every video on this channel is a test, a real landscape, a real challenge. No safety net, no crew, no shortcuts. If you've watched this far, you're not just a viewer. You're someone who understands what it means to be truly alive. Subscribe to Gobi Survival. Hit the bell. come back for the next story. Because out here in the Gobi, the desert doesn't wait. And neither do we. Gobi Survival. Subscribe now. The desert is always watching.